Born out of the early power electronics scene in England in the early 1980s, Ramleh would become a band that helped further the genre's development as well as pioneer some of its trademark aspects. While their earliest releases, such as May 31st, 1962 to 1982, would become infamous for their use of transgressive and shocking imagery, ranging from autopsy photos to what seemed like Nazi glorification, band leader Gary Mundy quickly became disillusioned with this practice once power electronics acts began receiving negative notice in the press, coming under scrutiny for the use of such imagery, regardless of intention. The original Ramleh split in 1984 and lay dormant for 2 years until Mundy reinvented Ramleh as a solo project in 1986 and began working on what can be argued as Ramleh's magnum opus. On an unknown date in 1987, Ramleh released Hole in the Heart on cassette through Mundy's own Broken Flag label. A cassette full of atmospheric drones, noise-laden synth dirges, and anguished, indecipherable vocals, a mixture that would lead to the development of an ambient offshoot of power electronics known as death industrial, and a mixture that would define one of the most important and well-known albums in the noise music canon. Today, we're going to take a look at it. Alright, I admit it. This one might alienate a couple of people. I haven't talked at length about this on the channel in any capacity outside of my favorite discoveries of 2019 video, which, yeah, I kinda don't have one for 2020 and I don't know if I ever will, but I did mention in the 2019 video that I started to come around on the concept of noise music. Now you might be thinking to yourself, noise music? Isn't that a bit, antithetical? Well, in a sense, yes. Noise pushes all predefined boundaries of music, and it's one of a couple genres that I can think of that absolutely takes the rules of music, let alone experimental music, and twists them to a degree that is so intense that most people are immediately turned off by the concept. I was one of those people, until I heard this album. To be fair though, I didn't exactly give myself the best starting point for this kind of stuff when I tried to listen to Merzbow's Pulse Demon for laughs, which at this point I now think is just an okay album. It's been little over 2 years since I first heard Hole in the Heart, and I don't think I'll ever forget my first listen. I was nervous, apprehensive, and yeah, a little terrified. I used to be pretty disturbed by just reading about power electronics stuff, the imagery that it explores, and just how loud and bludgeoning all of it is. I could never have fathomed that not only would I listen to an album in the genre, but attempt to make music in that genre and call quite a couple of albums and artists who've made music in the genre some of my favorites. Because Ramleh is actually one of a handful of artists that I owe a lot of musical inspiration to. And yeah, if you didn't know, I make music. I record more than I actually release any of it, but yeah. I don't really like bringing it up in public that much because I'm kinda insecure and shy about the whole thing, but it's true. And I stole my primary project's name from this album. Yep. So thank you, Gary Mundy. You helped an awkward young man get out of his comfort zone and start producing some actual musical material. With that being said though, let's finally get into explaining this incredible album. There are 2 versions of Hole in the Heart out there, technically speaking. The original 1987 cassette contains 4 tracks and runs just about 24 minutes. A 2009 CD reissue on the Dirter Promotions label appends a disc full of bonus tracks from this era of Ramleh's career, places the original 4-track album to the second disc instead of the first, for some reason, and adds a 24-minute track from another 1987 cassette called Pumping. For the sake of consistency, this review is going to cover the 2009 reissue edition in its entirety, but I'm going to begin with discussing the original 1987 cassette, since I see the original cassette album as the truly essential version of Hole in the Heart. More on that later. This is probably going to make for a long review, so strap in. Hole in the Heart's first track, Spear Flower, opens with a nearly 90-second blast of frenzied noise as a melodic progression tries to break its way through the layers of dirt and distortion. In fact, this is the trademark of Hole in the Heart that I have yet to hear in any other power electronics record, at least from this time period and also just off the top of my head. Melody. While Spear Flower is not a prime example of this concept, there are later tracks that I'm going to discuss that take the concept and push it to the very forefront. After this blast of noise comes to a sudden end about 85 seconds into the track, and industrial grinding takes over for the rest of it, as Mundy's vocals occasionally crash into the mix, washed in delays and recorded in a way that makes them indecipherable. His vocals on this track can only be compared to chanting, groans, moaning, and what I can only assume are anguished lyrics. And this track is honestly the only one on the album that truly strikes the power electronic sound the most. The industrial, almost mechanical instrumental work brings to mind sore muscles and aching bones, the kind of depressing and painful imagery that pervades this entire album for me. Perhaps this comes from the album's key inspiration, the 1986 death of French playwright and author Jean Genet, who is depicted on the original 1987 cassette's low-quality, photocopied cover art. Mundy created the album in response to Genet's death, which I assume is where the album's very funereal feeling comes from. In terms of my first listen, I knew that this album would become a favorite of mine from the very first second that I heard that blast of noise. It had me hooked and mesmerized from the very beginning. It is one of the closest things to pure catharsis I have ever heard in music alone, regardless of lyrics or anything else. I wish it took up more of the track, or there was more material on the album exactly like that, but those 85-ish seconds are all we get, and then it's gone. Maybe less is better. The track ends with the most abrasive moment on the entire album, an absolutely screeching feedback loop that is manipulated and pushed to its limits, before finally going into the next song. The title track comes next, a passionate and chaotic improv on noisy guitars. Much of this album's atmosphere, tone, and overall sound comes to fruition thanks to the lo-fi cassette production, an aspect that I am totally okay with, and it's honestly probably best displayed on this track. All it takes for Mundy to craft something completely powerful in a musical sense is a couple of layered, effective guitar tracks, and as someone who has attempted this exact concept before, I'd say he pulled it off pretty damn well. I will say that I think this track is my least favorite of the main four in the long run, but it isn't a dislike by any means, as I think everything on the original cassette has its place and works to its own advantages, including this track. I will also say that this track gives a hint to the future direction that Ramleh would take once they became a band again after the release of Hole in the Heart, as the project has been releasing mostly noise rock material since 1990. Also probably due in part to Mundy's collaborations with fellow Power Electronics scene member Matthew Bauer, leader of Pure, Total, and the more recognized Skullflower, which Mundy also collaborated with on numerous occasions. Not much else to say from me, as it was always the track that left me mostly short, sweet, and to the point. Product of Fear, on the other hand, might be the track that I have the most to say about, at least in terms of the original tape. An atmospheric and bleak synth provides most of the instrumentation for this 7-minute behemoth of emotion and pain, if I can be, slightly edgy for a moment. And Mundy once again manages to make a statement without a single lyric. Often seen as the tape's finest hour, which I personally believe is actually Spearflower. Maybe. I'm still not sure even 2 years later. It would make a lot of sense as to why this is seen as the best. It's arguably the most melodic, most accessible, and the most mind-blowing song of the whole experience. Also, both versions of the cover art really seem to accompany this harrowing song. On the original cassette cover, Genet's face is solemn and can be seen as almost hopeless and empty. Before I learned of the cover's origin, which took a lot longer than I'd like to admit, I assumed it was a random photo of a man that Mundy had stumbled across in some kind of zine, newspaper obituary, or prison record. Without the context, it felt unsettling to look at, but it also quickly became one of my favorite album covers ever. No single image could have encapsulated the feeling of this album for me any better, besides the 2009 cover art, which arguably makes a stronger connection to the music than the picture of Genet. This dark, Xeroxed photo of what seems to be a desert makes perfect sense to accompany the auditory landscapes of Hole in the Heart. Product of Fear in particular sounds post-apocalyptic, the sound of a world rid of humanity, a world full of emptiness and despair, loneliness and death. I can't draw for the life of me, but I have wanted to put this to an image for a while now. When listening to this track, I envision a skeletal human, close to death, with a literal hole in the heart, cowered up in the corner of a decrepit, dark building, similar to this frame from the promotional tour video for Pink Floyd's Shine On You Crazy Diamond, overlooking this landscape on the cover through a broken window while this song plays. It is entirely hopeless, bleak, and unsettling, and is without a doubt in my mind the defining moment of Hole in the Heart, its sound, and its ethos. The final track of the original cassette is Grazing on Fear 2, a track that manages to reach a similar level of hollowed out misery to Product of Fear. Opening with a crackling, distorted synth line, as well as an indecipherable vocal sample that already sounds pained, it quickly devolves into a fully muddled mess of sound as a more melodic synth piece enters the mix. If Product of Fear didn't sound painful enough for you, here's an extra dose to really make it hit home. The sea of noise that lies underneath the synth line is one of the most anxious and emotional moments on the entire album, and arguably one of the most sincerely emotional moments in any music I've ever heard, because this album is truly unlike anything else I've ever listened to, and I've been in search of something similar for 2 years, only coming close when I heard 2 albums by Total, Hard and Low and Beyond the Rim. I've sort of resigned this search to Hole in the Heart's unique approach, and I continue to turn to the album when I look for this kind of sound. After 6 minutes of this funereal piece, Mundy cuts the synths out and brings in his guitar once again. This following short piece is what brings the tape edition to a close, capping off 24 minutes of brutally cathartic music. Now I'd like to go over the reissue edition. As I mentioned before, the 2009 reissue appends a disc full of bonus tracks, as well as a track called True Religion, after the original 4 tracks from the cassette album. Now, the first disc contains all the bonus tracks except True Religion, and disc 2 is devoted to the original Hole in the Heart album alongside True Religion. I find this really irksome because the bonus tracks on disc 1 are culled from other 1987 Ramleh releases, such as the collab tape Nerve, the Broken Flag compilation album Never Say When, as well as a previously unreleased in full track, Do Not Come Near. They bear little resemblance to the material on Hole in the Heart, with the exception of Bite the Bolster from Never Say When, which is actually an excerpt of True Religion, which was also released under the name Bite the Bolster on Pumping. Talk about fucking confusing. Now, I see a lot of people citing this 90-minute version of Hole in the Heart with the extra disc of bonus tracks as the essential version to listen to. I do not agree with that, because I think this is not an expansion of Hole in the Heart, which I would be more inclined to recommend as the essential version, but rather a compilation that shares the same name as Hole in the Heart, the album. For example, if I can use one, fellow power electronics act Sutcliffe Eugen's 1982 behemoth album We Spit on Their Graves, a whopping 9.5-hour 10-tape box set, was reissued in 1997 on CD in an abridged 75-minute format. I consider that 1997 release a compilation and not the album, quote-unquote, since it adjusts the material on the album and disrupts the sequencing. Granted, that abridged version is the only one I've heard, so take my word with a grain of salt. However, I feel the same way about the 2009 reissue of Hole in the Heart, which I feel disrupts and bloats the original track list, especially considering that they put the bonus tracks first. The 23-minute red cap is the weak spot, the experimentation on which I find so annoying at points that I rarely go out of my way to hear the 90-minute version of the album, usually only sticking to the original 4 tracks alongside True Religion. I actually have to tell a lot of people that check the album out that disc 2 is the one with the original album, and that disc 1 is a bunch of technically unrelated bonus tracks. It kind of aggravates me at times that the sequencing is so off, but what can I really do? Judging the musical material, it's actually all still fantastic, even with the occasional dislike of some moments in Redcap. Bite the Bolster and Do Not Come Near are the standout tracks on disc 1, as well as True Religion on disc 2, which I will finally discuss to finish off the review. True Religion is a 24-minute epiphany that manages to take the atmosphere, ideas, and basic motifs of Hole in the Heart and push them to their refined limits. Mundy groans, screams, yells, and chants at numerous points in the song, devolving into what sounds like a repeated cry of no during the section that is edited down for Bite the Bolster on disc 1. He layers synths and guitars at multiple points, reaching a level of frigid distortion and auditory violence that only short moments on the original album could come close to capturing. The synths on this track wail, release anguished cries, and become their most dirge-like in the earliest half of the song. Waves of feedback swirl around as Mundy adds layers of noise throughout the track to truly pad out the atmosphere, and the track actually never stays in one place for too long, to its own benefit. You could almost say that this song has movements in a way that a Godspeed You Black Emperor song has movements, or a classical piece has movements. I mentioned in the intro to this video that Hole in the Heart helped pioneer the genre of death industrial, and while I think the 4 songs in the original tape do, help that to a very large extent, I think the truly pioneering piece comes in the form of True Religion. Its chaotic conclusion only makes for an even better closing piece than Grazing on Fear 2 on the original tape, and leaves me feeling satisfied every time, if not a little bit scattered and emotionally weathered, as there are only a few albums off the top of my head more depressing and emotionally pained than this one. With the final seconds of True Religion fading into nothingness, Hole in the Heart's 2-disc edition has reached its conclusion, and I can only hope that it has left the listener feeling changed upon a first-time listen, and if not changed, then at least leaving them feel a little bit touched or blown away. It is a rare occurrence to find genuine beauty and normalcy in this kind of music, and I'm honestly extremely glad that this album sounds the way that it does. In conclusion, I think Hole in the Heart is the definitive noise album, and it's certainly my favorite, as well as my go-to record to show to anyone interested in the noise genre. There are probably more accessible records out there, but I always give this one to people and tell them that if they can't get into disc 2 of the reissue, they'll probably have a hard time getting into any other noise material. This album has such a sense of importance to me that I have a hard time putting it into genuine words, as it inspired me to finally record and release music in some capacity, as well as getting me into one of the hardest genres to get into. And whether that was originally reluctant or not, I'm not sure. But I've definitely grown a bigger interest in noise as a result of this record. If you haven't heard the original 1987 cassette version of this album before this review, I highly recommend it. Try to go in with an open mind, and if you find that it's worth your while, seek out disc 1 of the reissue. This is actually one of the few Ramleh albums on Spotify and other streaming services, so thankfully it's relatively accessible to listen to. And I understand that this isn't for everyone, but I hope that someone manages to find this album and love it because of this review. That would be pretty cool. Hole in the Heart is ranked as one of my essential albums, and it is currently sitting at number 45 in my favorite albums of all time. With that, I give Ramleh's Hole in the Heart a 10 out of 10.